Welcome to the fourth lecture in the Marble Hill Autumn Lecture Series entitled Marble Hill Local to Global. If you've missed any of the autumn lectures so far, do please go to the Marble Hill YouTube channel, and there you can find all of the lectures that we've had. Marble Hill is being revived, and that's why we're celebrating this evening. This will see £8 million gifted to Marble Hill and its revival. And that £8 million is £5 million from the National Lottery and a further £3 million from English Heritage, the charity itself. This will see the house being free and open for 5 days a week and invested in, and with a lovely roof that doesn't leak. It also sees the landscape really invested in and some of those beautiful heritage parts brought back to life. It'll also see the most wonderful cafe, which is open now, and you can enjoy a great cup of coffee knowing that we're giving back to the charity with every sip. And also our sports facilities are being invested in with better drainage on our sports fields and new tennis courts, all for our community. And of course, there's a whole raft of different events. And so we're really delighted that you are here as part of this revival this evening. So it is really with great delight that tonight we welcome our speaker. We've had a host of really eminent speakers as part of the Autumn Lecture Series, and next week we have Dr. Carol Ann Dixon talking about enslavement history. But tonight's speaker is someone who may very well be well known to a number of you. She's been the wonderful chair of the Luminaries series and has hosted a whole raft of historic properties sharing about their heritage locally. But also she has a day job. She's a professor of 18th century literature at the Department of English in Royal Holloway, University of London, and she frequently appears on the BBC, on TV and radio. She's a dedicated trustee of Pope's Grotto, and hence why she got involved in the Luminaries. But we are so pleased that she's here this evening to talk about Marble Hill, and in fact, Marble Hill and Gulliver's Travels. So it's great delight to welcome Dr. Judith Hawley tonight.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction, and thank you to you all for being here. It's a pleasure for me to, in a way, get out of my glorified underpass. That Pope's Grotto is a tiny little property compared to Marble Hill. So it's a real pleasure to be able to sort of spread my wings and extend my range. And I'm going to be talking to you about a very extended range because I'm taking part in this attempt to locate Marble Hill House, both in its absolutely fabulous situation on the banks of the Thames in Twickenham, but also to see its links to the wider world. And my title is Henrietta Howard as Yahoo, Marble Hill and Gulliver's Travels, and all of those terms will become clearer in a moment. I'm going to try also very briefly to connect up my talk as a standalone lecture, but I want to connect it up with some of the previous lectures in the series and look forward to the next one so that you can see how the different talks link together. And it is great that these are all available on the YouTube channel for you to watch in perpetuity, if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to duplicate what they've said. So Tracy Borman gave a wonderful introduction to the whole of Henrietta Howard's life in a previous talk. And I'm only going to be focusing on a very short period of it. Mostly I'm going to be talking about 1726 and a few years on either side. So she gave a lovely talk about the whole of the career. And also mentioned some of the people I'm going to talk about in my lecture. She mentioned Alexander Pope and the wonderful compliment he pays to Henrietta in his poem on a certain lady at court, and also showed the beautiful portrait that Pope commissioned by Charles Jervis, the one with the long chestnut hair that you might know. It's also very useful to think about the things I'm saying in relation to Esme Whitaker's talk about the Marble Hill collection. She talked about a collection of sort of overlapping terms, Chinese, China, as in porcelain, chinoiserie, japanning. So she's talking about the oriental aspects of the decoration and of Henrietta's taste at Marble Hill. She also talked about some of the interchanges between European and Oriental craftspeople and how they were copying each other's designs and making things for each other's markets. And some of that is going to come up in what I talk about today. I'm also going to touch very briefly on the connections between Marble Hill and empire and slavery, just very briefly, and that's going to be mentioned in much greater depth and detail by Carol Ann Dixon later on. So I'll be looking at the ways in which this lovely spot on the Thames connects with the wider world by considering how Henrietta Howard's connections with her friends, a particular group of friends, takes us out into the empire and back again. And I'll be looking at a few material objects. You often learn a lot of the provenance and the makeup of an object can tell us all sorts of stories about the wider world. I'll be making connections particularly between Ireland, the West Indies and India. And some of these connections are built into the fabric of Marble Hill, and some I suggest are built into the sort of the fabric of the relationships she had with her friends. So here are the topics I'm aiming to cover. Henrietta Howard, so Mrs. Howard, the Countess of Suffolk, and the Scribblerians. I'll give you a brief indication of what I mean by that strange term, the Scribblerians. I'll talk about Marble Hill and Gulliver's Travels, as Rachel said, and I'll be focusing on a particular material object, Irish plaid, and I'll be linking that with the empire. So who were the Scribblerians and how does Mrs. Howard connect with them? The Scribblerians were a loose group, not quite a club, but a group of friends, politicians, writers, clergymen, who met around 1713, and they had regular meetings for a year or two, and they aimed to satirize the ills of the day, especially the sort of intellectual mistakes as they saw them, but also to support the politics of the Tory government, the then Tory government. So politics, literature, ideas are all part of what they're working with and find their way into Gulliver's Travels as well. And some of these people became very close friends. So we're looking at 1713, 14, and some of them were friends with Henrietta from 1718, 1720 onwards. So on the top row, we have John Gay, the chubby author of the wonderful ballad opera, The Beggar's Opera, became a very close friend of Mrs. Howard. Dr. John Arbuthnot, who was a royal physician and later on treated Henrietta Howard and Pope and a lot of her friends and a lot of the royal family. And then Alexander Pope, I've mentioned before, and he was her neighbour in Twickenham, just upstream slightly from her. On the bottom row, we have Jonathan Swift, the Irish cleric, satirist, political writer, and author of Gulliver's Travels in particular. And then another two that you might not know really, Thomas Parnell, who was another Irish cleric and a poet, a scholar as well, who died, I think, in 1718, didn't know Mrs. Howard, but was part of that group. And then Robert Harley, who was a very important sort of leading minister. He was the treasurer and in a way was a kind of a prime minister before Robert Walpole. And they used to meet in court, and this courtly association is something that also gives them a link with Mrs. Howard, who you might well know as somebody who became, as Tracy Borman says, through sheer chutzpah and will, became woman of the bedchamber for Caroline, Princess of Wales, later Queen, wife of George, Prince of Wales, later George II. And their relationships at court, their links, that knowledge of the world, that knowledge of gossipy politics and endless card games and bitching and manoeuvring and scheming in the corridors of power and the sort of the parlours of power and the ballrooms of power is something that they had a lot of experience of. She probably met Gay while they were both in Hanover trying to gain favour with the new Hanoverian regime. Arbuthnot she probably met at court. Arbuthnot probably introduced Henrietta to Pope, and then Pope very definitely made a connection with Swift for her. Pope, I hope you'll know as a poet and satirist, our leading poet of the 18th century, leading poet between Milton and Wordsworth, and it's absolutely, true. He really was a very, very significant poet. And one of the reasons he was significant is because of his satire on contemporary issues, but also of his great knowledge of the classics and his ability to bring the classics of Greece and Roman culture to the present day. And the thing that brought him to Twickenham is that he did a translation of Homer's The Iliad, which he managed to sell through a subscription and made enough money from that in order to fund his villa in Twickenham. And this villa in Twickenham was an important sort of cultural artifact. He was able to influence the taste of other builders in the area, including Mrs. Howard, both in the design of the building and in the laying out of the grounds. And that's something that's very important at Marble Hill. He was one of the several advisors to her on the laying out of her grounds. And this is a rather grainy image from a painting of Pope's villa. And you can see next to Marble Hill House that it shares some of the same classical, neoclassical features. Pope's villa is not a pure Palladian villa in the way that Mrs. Howard's is, but it has those features. Let's go inside for a moment, and I'm going to pick out a few of the objects in her great room and see what global connections they have, and then I'll be linking them with Pope and Swift in particular in a moment. So here's a photograph of the great room at Marble Hill House, which we hope soon will be open to us again, newly restored and revived. And I'm going to mention a couple of features of the way Howard chose to decorate this room. I'm going to refer to them as hybridity and also as temporal layering, rather grandiose ways of describing the kind of eclecticism and depth of her taste, a taste that's quite exemplary of the period. If you look in the shadows just above the caption saying the great room, you might be able to spy a shiny edge of a lacquered screen. And this is part of the chinoiserie taste that she had. It's sort of Chinese, it's japanned, which is a lacquering technique. It's a rather hybrid object. And it's kind of strange to see that in a room which is essentially neoclassical and Palladian. So that's the hybrid, the mixture of the sort of the Oriental and the Western in terms of the classical. And there's a kind of temporal layering too in this room. It's a room designed on, like the rest of the house, on Palladian lines, and that is deriving from the designs of Andreas Palladio, the 16th century architect, who designed a lot of the villas that line the Brenta Canal between Venice and Vicenza. So as this revival of the classical in the 16th century. And the idea is that the Brenta Canal kind of rivaled Tusculum, which is this area outside Rome, where in the 1st century BC, an awful lot of wealthy and powerful Romans built their retreats and beautiful villas, including Cicero. So Tusculum is to Rome as Twickenham is to London. It's the place where people like Pope and Mrs. Howard retreated to build their beautiful houses. So it's a very layered site, because you have the 18th century imitating Renaissance architecture, imitating Roman architecture, which is in itself imitating Greek architecture. And one of the links there that threads these things together, it's not just an arbitrary, oh, look, I quite like the shape of these rooms, or aren't those columns nice, is that they all are representing empire. So the Roman Empire is trying to borrow from some of the glory and power of the earlier Greek Empire. The Renaissance architects are capturing that power, that both cultural power and political and the power of wealth too. And the growing British Empire is consciously harking back to this classical past in order to say, look, we are in the line of succession. So there's that temporal layering as well. And the funding of Marble Hill House was very much dependent on the budding empire. You might well know that Howard, who was always strapped for cash, she was desperately poor earlier in her life. She was only able really to build the house because she was gifted money and goods by the Prince of Wales to buy it. And this large gift he gave her included jewellery, furnishings from her royal apartments, stocks worth about £11,500 in old money, and that would probably be about 1,300,000 and something, so under 1.5 million. So not really enough to buy a house in Twickenham now, perhaps, but quite a lot of money. But also, as Tracy Borman notes, he threw in a shipload of mahogany, slightly odd thing to do. And we'll hear more about this in a future talk, but I think it's worth pointing out that the stocks he gave her, this £11,500 worth of stocks, were in the South Sea Company, which you might well have heard of, certainly in 2008 when we're going through that huge banking crisis. The South Sea bubble, the bursting of the South Sea bubble, was an important precursor in this kind of collapse of a trading speculation. And it really was a sorry misadventure. The government, politicians, the royal family were all involved in pouring money into a scheme. There was insider dealing, corruption on a massive scale, and a lot of people lost their money, including Alexander Pope, probably. But the company was restructured. It must have made enough money that George, Prince of Wales, was able to gift Howard with this. And what was the South Sea Company set up to do? It was set up to help deal with the government debt by trading in slaves. The mahogany, the shipload of mahogany, was partly used to build this beautiful staircase that's still there. And mahogany during this period mostly came from Jamaica, so it was almost certainly hewed, cut down by slaves. So empire is very much part of the fabric of this building. There's another object, let me just flick back to that room. There's another object in this room that has links to slavery, but also to Henrietta's Twickenham neighbour, Alexander Pope. And that's this table, which is on the right of the room in the photograph. Now, this table, and I think there's a curious story about how it was lost and found again. It's one of several neoclassical objects that was designed for this room by William Kent, an important architect, furniture designer. He also designed dresses as well, apparently. And he designed Chiswick House. He contributed to the buildings and designs of Pope's garden. And Pope's, as I said, first built his villa with money that came from his translation of Homer's Iliad. And Gay thought that Pope had lost quite a lot of money when the South Sea bubble burst, and so he was obliged to translate Homer's Odyssey and to edit the works of Shakespeare to recoup his losses. And one of the little decorative devices in the translation of the Odyssey, as you can see in the top of this page here, is William Kent provided these little devices and scrolls. And I don't know if Henrietta chose this, but then this design formed the basis of the design of this table. Let me bring in Swift. In some ways, that's all sort of by the by, because what this talk is supposed to be about is about Gulliver's travels. But it's this notion of the wider empire, the hybridity and the layering, the classical, the modern. These are things that are going to come up when I talk about Swift. Now, Swift, when Queen Anne died in 1714, went to Ireland. He was completely persona non grata to the Hanoverians and to Robert Walpole. He was really out of favour, and he was sort of unhappily exiled to Ireland, where he became Dean of St Patrick's, continued to write, but became even more sort of grumpy and curmudgeonly. While he was in Ireland, he wrote Gulliver's Travels, which is partly about Ireland, but it's also about his experience of court when he was a member of the Scribblerians Club and his thoughts on contemporary politics. He came back to England in 1725 in order to publish it. And there's a wonderful moment, a period of this in the summer of 1725, when in Pope's Villa, Pope was working on his satire de Dunciad, Gay was finishing off Beggar's Opera, Arbuthnot was writing a treatise on the history of coins and medals, and Swift was finishing off Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels was actually sort of published from Pope's Villa, that Gay came up with a plot to publish it in secret. Anyway, when Swift said that he's going to come to England to publish Gulliver's Travels, Pope wrote to him and said he wanted to introduce him to somebody who's really going to be able to help him. He wanted to introduce Swift to a lady who is as deaf, though not so old as yourself. You'll be pleased with one another, I'll engage, though you won't hear one another. You'll converse like spirits by intuition. What you must wonder at is she is considerable at court, yet no party woman, and lives in court, yet would be easy and make you easy. So Henrietta Howard had started to lose her hearing in her 20s. In 1725, she was, I think, around 37. Swift was much older. He was 58 and had suffered from a disease later recognized as Meniere's disease, which involved, like Henrietta, he had terrible headaches. He also had vertigo and a strange ringing in his ears, which really upset him a lot. And this idea of the two of them sitting next to each other in sympathy with each other, communicating like spirits and unable to hear each other, is quite charming. But there's also a very important feature here, is that she is a courtier. She's a woman of the bedchamber to Princess Caroline. It's known that that George will come to the throne. So lots of people assumed that one way to influence and gain favour with the Prince of Wales, the future monarch, was to pay court to ladies of the bedchamber and people like Mrs. Howard. And there is a suggestion here, a very strong suggestion from Pope, that Swift would be able to do this by making friends with Henrietta Howard. But he also says that she would be a true friend, that she's not a party woman. She is neutral like the Swiss, and she's actually a really good company. She'd make you feel right at home. And the two of them did become friends. And in the two separate trips, 1726 and then later in 1727, when Swift came to England, he spent a lot of time at Marble Hill, sometimes when Henrietta wasn't there, and he reminisces several times about drinking his way through her wine cellar and helping herself to things in her ice house without her permission. And he wrote a lovely poem in 1727 when George II ascended the throne. Swift imagines Marble Hill and Richmond Lodge, the royal residence, both being empty, in the two houses coming to talk to each other and having a chat about their situations. And he sort of teases her and says that she's going to be ruined by this. He came to England 1726 to publish Gulliver's Travels. And let's look at the title page of this. So the title page, like lots and lots of books in the 18th century, doesn't bear the real author's name. It purports to be by one Lemuel Gulliver, and Swift maintained this fiction that he hadn't written Gulliver's Travels. It was a very seditious satire and would have got him in a lot of trouble. Some of his publishers were imprisoned in the past for publishing his works. And in his correspondence with Henrietta Howard, he pretended not to have written it, pretended not to understand what she was talking about, and even wrote her a letter in the person of Gulliver, and made her a little present of a Lilliputian crown, a little tiny gold crown, which supposedly remained in the family for several generations. So he traveled to remote nations, and the book is written in 4 parts: the voyage to Lilliput, the little people, the voyage to Brobdingnag, the land of the giants. In part 3, he goes through a series of islands, Laputa, Balnibarre, and so forth, which are sort of satires on science and on politics. And in part 4, he goes to the country of the Houyhnhnms, the horses. The Princess of Wales, when she met Swift, Arbuthnot formally introduced Swift to the Princess of Wales. She loved him. She thought he was great company, very, very entertaining. And the princess encouraged Henrietta to correspond with Swift so that she would take the letters and she would paste them into a big red and gold letter book that she had and keep the correspondence. She really wanted this friendship to keep going because it so entertained her. And Arbuthnot gave an account of how the princess enjoyed Gulliver's travels, and said, when in November 1726, I had the honour to see Princess Caroline when she was reading Gulliver, was just come to the passage of the hobbling prince, which she laughed at. And the hobbling prince was a portrait of her husband, and she particularly liked the fact that Gulliver's travels belittles and makes fun of George I in the form of the Emperor of Lilliput. He's one of the little people, and she hated her father-in-law, so she thought this was a good way of cutting him down to size. So Swift in his Gulliver's Travels mentions these imaginary places that he visits, but these places are all just on the hinterland, he claims, of the real world. And in each of the parts, Gulliver says, I went to this place and that place, and then I ended up in this strange world that isn't mentioned on any of the maps. Here's some of the places that he mentions as the real place he mentions on his voyages. He goes to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Amsterdam and Lisbon. He crosses the Atlantic to visit the West Indies. He travels down the coast of Africa, rounds the Cape of Good Hope to enter the Indian Ocean via the Straits of Madagascar. He calls in at Fort St. George in Madras, now Chennai. He makes his way to Hanoi, sails around Australia to Japan, and crosses the Pacific to land somewhere off the coast of Canada. I mentioned these real places because they help make sense of the letter that Henrietta sent, that Swift and Henrietta sent to each other, that I'm going to read now. And also I think they give a sense of that hybridity in the layering, that these are real places and fictional places being merged together in the imagination. So once Swift returned to Ireland after publishing Gulliver's Travels, he wrote this letter, and I'm going to read out these extracts and then unpack them a little bit. He wrote to her, about, first of all, saying that she had sent him a ring. So this is why he sent her the crown of Lilliput. She sent him a fairly cheap ring. He insisted on this cheapness. I think it cost £1 or something. And every time he looks at his finger, he sees this ring and he's reminded of her. And he says, being perpetually teased with the remembrance of you by the sight of your ring on my finger, my patience at last is at an end. And in order to be revenged, I here send you a piece of Irish plaid made in imitation of the Indian, wherein our workmen here are grown so expert that in this kind of stuff they are said to excel. They are said to excel that which comes from the Indies. And because our ladies are too proud to wear what is made at home, the workman is forced to run a gold thread through the middle and sell it as Indian. But I ordered him to leave out that circumstance, that you may be clad in Irish stuff and in my livery, in my colours. But I beg you will not tell any Parliament man from whence you had this plaid, otherwise out of malice they will make a law to cut off all our weavers' fingers. It's a long letter, I'm going to continue and then I say break it up. I must likewise tell you, to prevent your pride, my intention is to use you very scurvily. For my real design is that when the princess asks you where you got that fine nightgown, you are to say that it is an Irish plaid sent you by the Dean of St. Patrick's, who with his most humble duty to her Royal Highness is ready to make her such another present at the terrible expense of 8 shillings and 3p a yard, and if she will descend on Ireland with receiving and wearing it. And in recompense, I, who govern the vulgar, will take care to have her Royal Highness's health drank by 500 weavers as an encourager to the Irish manufactory. And I command you to add that I am no courtier, nor have anything to ask. So he's really imperious and giving his orders here. Let me go back over some of the passages and explain what I think is going on. So he mentioned this ring, as I said earlier, and he's going to revenge her for the pleasure she's giving him in this rather perverse way by sending her a piece of Irish plaid made in imitation of the Indian. By plaid, he means checked cloth, like the Scottish tartan. So it's a checked cloth made in imitation of the Indian, which the Irish workmen are grown really good at. And it's in other letters he refers to it as silk, and sometimes he refers to it as poplin, which would have been a combined wool and silk fabric, which the Irish were particularly good at. Now, I haven't been able to find any pictures of 18th century Irish plaid, but I've got these pictures from the wonderful V&A costume archive of some from the 1850s, which I hope are similar. So these are silk and wool woven plaids. Now, during the 18th century, well, at the end of the 17th century, a lot of French Huguenot Protestant refugees came over to Dublin, as they did to London too, and set up their silk weaving businesses. And they combined with the very skillful Irish woolen merchants, and they made lots and lots of fabric. By 1730, apparently there were about 3,000 people employed in the silk weaving industry in Dublin alone. Ireland is better known now for its linen trade, but in the 18th century, they wove many, many more fabrics, some of which were imitations of other fabrics, calimancos, name derived from the Spanish, Dutch velvets, Geneva velvets, German serges, taffety, pas de soie from the French peur de soie. So it's always been the case with fabrics that fabrics themselves are traded, and then local craftspeople try to imitate the foreign goods, and then sometimes those goods then are re-exported to the original company. So there's a funny circularity of the trade. He says in particular that this Irish plaid is made in imitation of the Indian. And here from the same archive at the V&A are some, so I hope that my image isn't covering the captions here, but this is Madras checked cotton from, again, from about 1855. And this, I think, is the sort of thing that the Irish were imitating. And this is specifically a yarn dyed woven, so that the fabric is, the threads are dyed to the individual colors, and then they're woven into this pattern. It's not a printed fabric like chintz. The pattern is dyed in. This is how you can run gold threads. I think there's a little gold thread running along this one. So these fabrics were, the trade in this fabric was really set up by the East India Company. They were exporting a lot of cotton fabrics from India, and some of them they didn't think were good enough quality. And they found a village called, they found a village, and of course it was there and everybody knew about it who lived there, knew India. But this village, Madras Patnam, they found it was of good quality. So they established a trading post, and they set up Fort St. George to protect this trading post. And Fort St. George is one of the places that Gulliver calls in at on his journeys. The Madras fabric ended up not being a particularly luxurious fabric, unlike the silk plaid, the Irish silk plaid. But it became incredibly popular. There's a whole link with Yale University and preppy fashions that we could think about later on. But what I want to draw attention to is this complex interchange between the fabric industries in the different countries. So the Europeans are first importing foreign goods, and then they start to imitate them. And they do that for two reasons. One is that they want to strangle the foreign trade. You know, they want to cut the profits of the Indians themselves. And also they very often assert their superiority. Look, here are these, you know, humble craftspeople who've made this stuff, but we, with our scientific methods, our technology and our financial resources, can make it much, much better. We have got all these superior technical innovations. The case of the Irish weaving industry is complex, because the Ireland was in effect a colony of Britain during this period. It had its own parliament, but was really controlled from England. And this is a source of great resentment to Swift, and he builds that resentment into Gulliver's Travels. And there are various acts of the English Parliament, such as the Woolens Act of 1699, which prevented the Irish from exporting their woolens in order to protect the English and British woolen industry. So he's trying to encourage, Swift is trying to encourage the export of Irish luxury fabric, one that isn't covered by the Woolens Act, this silk plaid, but he's also trying to encourage wealthy Irish people to wear their own goods, which they didn't do. So the Anglo-Irish, of which he was a member, tended to buy imported goods. And he says he repeatedly wrote attacks on the way in which Anglo-Irish women bought foreign clothes. And there are several pamphlets in the 1720s, one here, a proposal for the universal use of Irish manufacture, rejecting and renouncing everything wearable that comes from England. In this mid-1720s, he wrote a series of attacks on a British policy of sending cheap coinage to Ireland, the campaign known as Wood's Halfpence, and he adopted the persona of a drapier, a seller of fabric. So the wearing of fabric, the promotion of fabric, was a really important part of his political campaign. And the weavers of Ireland, when he says, I could control the vulgar, the weavers of Ireland adored him for it. And when he came back to Ireland after his trips to England, they would ring the bells in his honour. His arrival was reported in the press. On his birthday, bonfires were lit to celebrate the way in which he liberated the Irish from the imposition of this coinage. So he's sending this Irish plaid to Henrietta, and he tells her to have it made into a nightgown and to parade this in front of Princess Caroline. Caroline goes, oh, I love that dress. Where did you get it from? Oh, I got it from my friend Swift. He'll send you some fabric. And Swift says, I don't want to be paid for it. I just want her to keep buying this stuff. And all the weavers will, 500 weavers will raise a glass to her. Now, I don't have any images of what this would have been made into, but it should point out that a nightgown is not a night dress. It's not something you'd wear in bed. You might wear it in the evening. So a nightgown is sometimes called an English gown. Couldn't find any pictures of plaid English gowns, but this is a French gown in a kind of plaid fabric to give you some kind of impression of what the dress would have been like. But actually, according to Arbuthnot, Henrietta didn't have time to have this fabric made up into a dress, because the package arrived when she was at court in the presence of the princess, and Henrietta took the letter and started reading it. And the princess saw the fabric and said, oh, that's lovely. I must have that. That looks just so beautiful. The princess immediately seized on the plaid for her own use and has ordered the young princesses to be clad in the same. So her three little daughters in descending scales were all given matching dresses. And what would they have looked like? This sort of curvaceous Princess Caroline and her little mini-me's all dressed up together in matchy outfits. I would love to have seen it. Of course, we can't see it, but again, the Irish plaid, the fabric ends up in Marble Hill House as well. Swift gave gave Henrietta enough fabric to make bed hangings, possibly a bed cover, and curtains for a room known as her plaid room, which was on the second floor of Marble Hill House. And I think that there's going to be some attempts to represent the appearance of that when Marble Hill opens shortly. Maybe Rachel can correct me on that, but there might be some evidence of what it might have looked like. So how did Henrietta respond to this? I think I'm going over length, but I do want to cover this amazing letter that she wrote in reply. And in it, she shows what a witch she is and why it is that so many people adored her, I think, because she's so clever. And she writes in imitation of Gulliver's Travels. This slide. She asked Swift to send over for the princess enough fabric to use the height of the Brobdingnagian dwarf multiplied by 2.5. The young princesses must be taken care of. Theirs must be in 3 shares. For a short method, you may draw a line of 20 foot, and upon that, by 2 circles, form an equilateral triangle. Then measuring each side, you'll find the proper quantity and division. If you want a more particular or better rule, I refer you to the Academy of Lagarde. So what she's doing is she's taking the measurements of a dwarf in the land of the giants, giving him a sum to measure it by in order to calculate how much fabric. So you've got the height of Caroline, and then the princess is how much fabric he'll need. And she mentions this method of forming an equilateral triangle by drawing 2 circles. And this is an image of how this would have been done. And almost certainly Henrietta would have known how to do this herself. She was taught maths by Argyll or Islay, so she knew what she was talking about. She's also combining, I mentioned this sort of layering and hybridity. She's got book 2 of Gulliver's Travels with the Brobdingnagian dwarf. She's also got the Academy of Legado, which appears in part 3. So she's conflating these different things. And the Academy of Legado is partly a satire on the Royal Society. And it is the case that the Royal Society, the science of the Royal Society, is partly being used in order to gain useful knowledge so that the empire can expand. So the letter goes on, and it's got lots of other allusions to Gulliver, but I just want to end with this bit, the end of her letter. I cannot conclude without telling you that our island is in great joy, so our island of Britain, as opposed to Ireland or one of Gulliver's islands. Our island is in great joy. One of our Yahoos having been delivered of a creature half ram and half Yahoo, and another has brought forth 4 perfect black rabbits. May we not hope, and with some probability expect, that in time our female Yahoos will produce a race of Houyhnhnms? I am, sir, your most humble servant, Civ Yahoo. Really odd and complex letter with lots and lots of densely packed allusions. So the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms are the creatures in part 4 of Gulliver's Travels that I mentioned earlier. She also alludes to a monstrous birth of something that's half ram and half Yahoo, and a person who's given birth to black rabbits. And this is almost certainly an allusion to Mary Toft, who supposedly gave birth to rabbits. I can talk about that afterwards if you're interested. It's a pretty extraordinary hoax and unpleasant tale. But let's think about what she's saying about Yahoos and Houyhnhnms. And if you have read Gulliver's Travels, you might well know about the Houyhnhnms, are these rational creatures who are basically horses, very clever horses, who are in some ways meant to be the morally and intellectually superior beings on the island. And they rule over the Yahoos, who are these disgusting, hairy beasts with filthy habits and depraved appetites. And here they are depicted in, I think, a late 19th century, early 20th century illustration. The Yahoos are the beasts of burden, and they're pulling a sledge which bears the horse. So this is a kind of complete topsy-turvy reversal of what we expect. There are also some really unpleasant details. So the Yahoos are enslaved by the Houyhnhnms, and they're just treated as animals, so much so that their skin is used in the place of leather. And the Yahoos, who are they? They are depraved beasts, but they're also humans like us. And in this disturbing passage from Gulliver, Gulliver realizes when he comes face to face with a Yahoo that he's the same as them. He thought they were the other, he thought they were different, but actually they are humans. And here he uses terms, rather disturbing terms, about the savage nations. And the terms that he uses are terms that are used both in accounts of travels to Africa, the Indies, the West Indies, of savage people, primitive savage peoples, but they're also the language Swift uses himself when he's describing the native Catholic Irish. He thinks of them as lesser beings. But what's really surprising about the letter from Henrietta Howard is that she signs herself Yahoo, Civ Yahoo. Civ is a code word used in book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, meaning a court lady. A court lady is like unto a sieve, that she's a leaky vessel. She cannot keep any secrets, which is certainly ironic because Henrietta Howard was this very neutral. She was not a party woman. She was a Swiss neutral person who can be trusted with the secret, partly because she couldn't hear what you're saying to her because she was deaf. So Civ is being used ironically, but she calls herself a Yahoo. She calls herself one of these disgusting beasts. And I think this is rather wonderful. And this is my last point. That we think of Swift's satire in the Gulliver's Travels as saying we should all be more like the horses. We should be like Houyhnhnms and be rational. But she's saying, no, I'm happy to be a Yahoo in a way. And others of Swift's friends felt the same. The Earl of Peterborough wrote to Swift, and he's a mutual friend of Howard and Swift, in the Yahoo language. And Bolingbroke wrote to Swift, who was then staying with Gay and Pope at Pope's Villa in Twickenham, addressing them as the three Yahoos of Twickenham. So Henrietta Howard willingly embraces her Yahoo nature with her friends. And what this suggests to me is this recognition that we all are Yahoo, that there's one human race that inhabits the whole world. We are all global. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Judith. And I certainly, I love the idea of her feeling like she's a Yahoo and almost like a little bit like she's one of the others, maybe. Thank you also for bringing in lots of imagery about the plaid. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the weaving process? Do you know anything about it yourself?
Yes, it's sort of fairly standard weaving process. So there would have been, if it is poplin, there would have been vertical woolen threads. They're stronger and thicker, and they give the poplin this sort of slightly bobbly and lumpy feel. And the silk would have been the horizontal threads, and you decide on your patterns in advance. And in the case of the plaid that Swift sent, he mentions the colours of purple, yellow, and something else, and they're an imitation of there's a complex technical detail that they're in imitation of. But there's exchanges in their correspondence where they're both talking about how the pattern has to be really carefully made. He wants it disposed in the right way. And the weaver takes much longer to make it than he plans, because he discards several batches of it because they're not perfect. And because he's sending this stuff as a gift to the princess, he wants it to be just so. So it's real dedicated craftsmanship.
Wow, I mean, it certainly looked like it, and but I love the madras as well. I thought that was very, very beautiful. There's a question about the relationship between Swift and Henrietta. From this point on, you talk about it being a kind of short time scale that you're talking about now, but what happens later on?
Yeah, it's really sad, actually, and it doesn't reflect very well on Swift, I'm afraid. So I said that he came back for a second visit in 1727, and that was partly prompted by the death of George I and the accession of George II. So the Prince of Wales becomes king. And Swift, I think, sees this as an opportunity to perhaps get back into power. And as I said, that a lot of people used Henrietta as they used lots of courtiers and lots of people in the royal household as ways of influencing the princess, and through that, George himself. And I think Swift wanted a better job for himself. He wanted a bishopric in England. He also wanted a better job for John Gay. And so he did quite a lot of wheedling and campaigning, and it got him nowhere. Gay was eventually offered a really insulting post as a gentleman usher to one of the little princesses dressed in plaid, which he turned down. He thought his friend said, this is beneath you, even though he'd written versions of Aesop's fables, and so he was known as kind of as a children's author in that period. Gay was disappointed, but eventually said, yeah, whatever, fine, I'm not a courtier, that's just fine. And Henrietta and also the Duchess of Queensberry rallied round, and they looked after Gay, and they loved him up. But Swift was really, really bitter. And he wrote some very unpleasant pieces. He wrote a document called A Character of Mrs. Howard, sort of warning her that if she didn't watch out, she would become sort of nasty and corrupt. In return for the plaid, he told the Queen he didn't want her money. He wanted some medals to be cast specially for him. And these never materialized. And he wrote a nasty footnote to a poem about these medals, and blamed Mrs. Howard for their non-appearance. So he just turned against her and couldn't be reconciled to her at all.
It seems so sad, considering.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. I mean, the Princess Caroline made sure that Mrs. Howard didn't have much influence over the king. She made sure that it didn't happen, and it was not fair of Swift to assume that this friendship would be a route to advancement for himself. But he held grudges. That was in his nature.
But what was his relationship with Gay?
A very close friend of Gay, and Gay was treated a little bit like a sort of chubby kidult. He was never sort of fully treated like a responsible adult, and he felt that Henrietta should have done more for Gay, that he was more in need of support because he didn't have any kind of job, unlike Swift himself with his deanery in Ireland. But Gay just he came to terms with it, and he didn't hold a grudge.
Well, it's just a sad story that they, you know,
Yeah.
they had such a friendship, and
they wrote amazing letters to each other for a period of about 3 or 4 years, and then
one of our audience has asked about whether you can elaborate on that Mary Toffs and the Rabbits story.
Oh, yes, this is very weird. I don't know if you've seen that wonderful film with Olivia Colman as Queen Anne, The Favourite, and there are lots of rabbits around in there. I think that's an allusion to it. So there's a woman called Mary Toffs in Godalming who claimed to be giving birth to rabbits. And this was, the Royal Society covered lots of mysterious births, monstrous births. And there were always these accounts in newspapers and in serious scientific papers of things which were beyond our ken. And, you know, science is in its early days, and people are sort of interested in things which seem to break the boundaries, and what might they teach us. They didn't have the boundaries that we have, a sort of sense of where species begin and end. And various doctors went down to Godalming and examined her and saw her giving birth to rabbits. And this was, you know, really sexually dubious that these male doctors were examining this woman. And they wrote papers in support of it. And Pope wrote a long poem about it. Eventually, it was discovered that obviously she wasn't giving birth to rabbits, and it was a hoax, possibly connived at by her husband, that they were taking rabbit embryos and inserting them in her, and she would produce them when the doctors were there. She then became the center of this kind of, you know, what would now be a Twitter storm. There's a huge satire, and it was used as a way of telling other stories about monstrosity and fecundity and male prurience. Pope, Arbuthnot, and Swift all wrote about it. It was a scandal for about a year or more.
I'm not surprised. It sounds horrific.
Yeah, it really was. It really was.
But to be put in newspapers and things, and you say that this was a regular thing, that kind of there were talks about lots of different kind of birds.
Yes, two-headed lambs, or so these would be actual animal births, or women who had given birth to strange fetuses, because there was this myth of the effect of the maternal imagination on the fetus. So women couldn't really be trusted. Pope wrote a poem called On the Characters of Women, and he said that most women have no character at all, matter too soft, a lasting mark to bear. So the idea is that women are kind of malleable, like melted wax, and the fetus in the womb can take the impression of the thought that the mother is having. So sometimes they would blame the mother if she gave birth to something odd. Maybe she'd been craving this. There's one account of a child born with a hand that looked like a lobster's claws, or the mother had walked through Billingsgate Market and seen a lobster. Was sometimes used as an excuse that if a woman gave birth to a black baby, she'd been thinking about black people, not that she had had sex with a black man, but that she'd obviously been thinking about. Yeah. So I think this is a test of that theory that the mother must have been thinking of rabbits, therefore gives birth to rabbits.
You think Henrietta's strength may have been a counterattack to some of those thoughts?
Yes. You know, this woman of reason. I mean, she knows that this can't be true. Yeah.
And intellect and wit.
Yes, yeah. And her response to Swift when he wrote these nasty letters to her was, you know, I'm still your friend. I still care about you. I'm rising above it. She never descended into nastiness.
You know, she just tried to get along with everybody.
Yeah.
People have said that perhaps that was because she actually couldn't hear, and so therefore
that's not impossible. Or that she had to kind of cauterize her feelings because she had such a horrible marriage, as I'm sure many of you will know. That her husband was a real brute, and there might have been a way in which she had to create a carapace around herself to protect herself from that.
Yes, it was a pretty horrific start, but we're so pleased that she found Marble Hill and actually found
yes, and built this amazing jewel for herself to enjoy, where she could express her personality in how she decorated the house, but also how she entertained her friends there. It is really a house built for friendship.
And perhaps she felt that she could be her own Yahoo there.
Yes, and Yahoo sucks to the others.
Huge thanks for today. We really look forward to welcoming you to the house when it is open, and indeed all of the people on this talk. We are so grateful for you bringing alive that relationship of Yahoos together.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.